What's going on, guys? Welcome back to Geek Culture Explained. My name is Rob, and in this video, I'm going to explain to you guys how it is that I know why the multiverse is falling apart in Spider-Man No Way Home. So if you guys have seen the plot leaks and the rumors and all that kind of good stuff, the multiverse is quite literally falling apart. And that's the reason why we get Andrew Garfield's Spider-Man and Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man and Tom Holland's Spider-Man all appearing in the same movie, along with Electro and Dr. Octopus and the Green Goblin from the Sonyverse. Now the question you're probably asking yourself is, how could this happen? How could the multiverse be falling apart? Isn't the multiverse a great big huge place and it takes a lot of energy and power to make it happen? Yes, it does. And I think Wanda's the reason behind it. But before we get into that, let's do a little bit of comic book explanation here. Let's explain how the multiverse works in Marvel Comics, and then let's explain what the Marvel Cinematic Universe is doing with it and actually changing it, because how they're handling Dormammu is totally different. So the multiverse in Marvel Comics is exactly what you would expect, a combination of universes, and there's actually an infinite number of them. Most of them you will never see or hear anything about, but the ones that you do see and do hear about have a numerical designation assigned to them. But it wasn't until the Captain Britain stories a few decades ago that Marvel actually gave the main Marvel Comics universe a numerical designation that came in the form of Earth 616. The numerical designation for the MCU is 199,999, and it's actually based off two universes in Marvel Comics. The first one is Earth 1610, which you guys might know as the Ultimate Universe. It was essentially an answer to the question in the year 2000, what would it look like if superheroes literally existed in the world outside your window? The other universe is Earth 98, which doesn't really have a cool name like the Ultimate Universe, but it's basically an alternate reality where superheroes age in real time. So let's break universes down in the simplest of forms. You guys already know that you have planets and stars and galaxies. We don't need to run over that. But what you do have are things called pocket dimensions. These are places like Asgard, where the Asgardians dwell, Olympia, where you have Zeus and Hera and the other Greek gods, the Crimson Cosmos, where you have the demon entity Sidorak. Now there's only three ways to get to these pocket dimensions. The first is to use a transportation or teleportation device inherent to that pocket dimension. If you look at Asgard, for example, you've got the Bifrost. The second way to do it is to use magic. Doctor Strange does that. The third way to do it is to alter reality in such a way to where you can basically create a portal to get to those realms. That's what Scarlet Witch can do. But barring those three ways, there's no other conceivable way to get to those particular dimensions. Even when the Fantastic Four are using technology, they're still using it to open portals. So let's expand this out. Outside of these individual universes, every other universe is essentially the same way. Every universe has its own Asgard. Every universe has its own Dormammu. Every universe has its own Sidorak, and so on and so forth. All the cosmic entities that exist there. Every universe has its own version of Thanos. It just kind of repeats itself. They just take different forms depending on the circumstance. The Ultimate Universe had a version of Asgard and Thor and Odin and Loki and all those characters that were more in line with real-world Norwegian mythos. But while each one of these universes functions in its own way, you've also got organizations out there that exist to make sure the universe functions the way it's supposed to. If every universe comes into existence by way of alterations to the time stream, then the job of the Time Variance Authority, which we'll see on Loki, actually exists to make sure that people don't change the timeline. So Loki doesn't go back in time and then make sure he succeeds in defeating all the Avengers on Earth in the original Avengers film. If he did that, it would create an alternate reality. And while one person doing that isn't necessarily a problem, if you have a multiverse consisting of infinitely expanding universes and at least one person in every single one of those universes decides to go and change time, suddenly it becomes an absolute nightmare to try to manage, and the whole multiverse just spirals out of control. So the TVA makes sure that nobody ever really does that. What you also have here is you have the Omniversal Development Court. If the main Marvel universe has the Avengers and the X-Men and the Fantastic Four and Spider-Man and all those different heroes that all kind of came to fruition somewhere along the line, the Omniversal Development Court exists to make sure that every universe does that. So every universe has its Avengers and it has its X-Men and it has its Spider-Man and so on and so forth. In the case that they come across a universe where that doesn't exist, they initiate something called the push. And the push basically jumpstarts the evolution of humanity to make sure that mutant genes are activated. A really good example of them doing this and it absolutely going horribly awry was during the Crooked World storyline, when they went to an alternate reality called Earth 238 and they realized there's no superheroes here. So they initiated the push to create superheroes. A guy by the name of Mad Jim Jaspers, who had the ability to alter reality on a universal scale and was the reason why no superheroes existed in that universe because he basically killed them all, got pissed. He initiated the Jaspers Warp, which totally twisted and skewed that universe, and the only way to stop him was to destroy his universe. Now, let's switch over to the Marvel Cinematic Universe for a second. By all standards of measurement, from what we've seen, the Marvel Cinematic Universe seems to effectively have this same thing. You don't really see beings like Sidorak because Sidorak existed as an X-Men property first before he was a Doctor Strange character, and basically all the X-Men stuff belonged to Fox. Not anymore. Disney owns it all, so you'll likely see Sidorak going forward. But the character of Dormammu is where things become particularly interesting. And the reason why is because in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, unlike in Marvel Comics, Dormammu does not exist in a pocket dimension that exists in a singular universe. Dormammu exists in an entire universe unto himself. Marvel is yet to consolidate the difference between the MCU version of Dormammu and the version that we know in comics, and at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter all that much. He rules an entire universe and probably a few other dimensions around that universe that he calls the Dark Dimension. The big difference between the Dark Dimension in the Marvel Cinematic Universe and the Dark Dimension in Marvel Comics is that in Marvel Comics, the Dark Dimension is actually a smaller section of a plane of existence that at one point was a much bigger section. What happened? We don't know. All we know is that somewhere along the line, that dimension fractured and it broke off into smaller dimensions. They became known as the Splinter Realms, which is where you get guys like Mephisto, Nightmare, the Hell Lords, and the Nightmare Lords, Dream Lords, as some people call them. In the Marvel Cinematic Universe, it's not that way. Seemingly, Dormammu came into existence somewhere along the line. And instead of the Dark Dimension fracturing off into smaller dimensions, instead, he conquered the entirety of the universe and then he subjugated all the other realms around him, basically meaning that beings that we would normally assume to be Mephisto, Nightmare, people like that, if they do exist in the MCU, and there's no reason to believe they don't, they all basically exist at the pleasure of Dormammu. Whether they're actually servants or not, we don't necessarily know. It could be one of these things where Dormammu's like the president of his realm, and the other people are basically governors, kind of ruling their own little sections. We don't really know. We haven't been given an explanation of how that whole hierarchical structure works in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. So back to our main question. Why is the multiverse falling apart in Spider-Man Far From Home and presumably going into Doctor Strange 2, which explains the multiverse of madness? Well, what's really going on here is that if that really is the case, then all we're really seeing is the multiverse falling apart as it refers to Spider-Man and really nobody else. It may very well be one of these things that this is how they're explaining how the X-Men and the Fantastic Four are going to end up in the MCU, that they already exist in other universes, but because it's all kind of falling apart, that they're basically going to end up in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. This is what we call a multiversal collapse. It took place in 2015 with Jonathan Hickman's Avengers and New Avengers, followed by Secret Wars. If you never read those stories, check the description. You'll find the whole playlist down below. The important thing here is that what separates each individual universe is a relatively thin energy membrane, and you can actually bypass this membrane depending on what kind of abilities you have. It's much like trying to access a pocket dimension. Only somebody of sufficient energy, somebody like Doctor Strange, somebody like the Scarlet Witch, can actually bypass this membrane and just walk right into an alternate reality. If you were able to do that, it would quite literally look like you were passing through an invisible wall, and what you see is completely different. So say, for example, that in Spider-Man No Way Home, that the multiverse really is falling apart, and you have a kind of coming together of different universes. You would see Spider-Man walking down the street, he would turn a corner, and he would pass what looks like a thin wall and end up in a completely different version of New York, or maybe there's hovering cars or something along those lines. That's basically how it would look to you. You wouldn't realize what was going on until you looked back and saw what was basically a portal, or you walked back through that membrane again, but it's basically invisible to the naked eye. Only people like Doctor Strange that have the ability to cast spells to reveal this actual membrane would know that it's there. But the reason why it's all falling apart, I think, is because of Wanda Maximoff. The Wanda Maximoff, having taken on the role of the Scarlet Witch in the Marvel Cinematic Universe in WandaVision, has now been elevated to a multiversal character. We know that for two reasons. One, because she's going to be in the multiverse of madness, and it really wouldn't make a whole lot of sense to have a character who's not a multiversal threat be in a movie about the multiverse. The other reason is because Marvel told us that. But the big thing about this is that Scarlet Witch has, for some reason or another, started messing with things. Maybe it's because she's just jumping from one universe to the next, looking for her kids, who she basically had to destroy at the end of WandaVision, hoping they're alive in some alternate reality where maybe she doesn't exist. She can adopt them and then live happily ever after. Maybe she's being tricked and used by some kind of energy source out there. Mephisto, Nightmare, Dormammu, who really knows for certain? But I think Scarlet Witch is the reason why all it's happening. And I think what's going to happen here at the end of Doctor Strange 2, and how it's all going to completely change the stage for the Marvel Cinematic Universe, is you're basically going to see a multiversal collapse. You're going to see a handful of realities that survive being destroyed during the events of Doctor Strange 2. Those realities that do survive are going to be merged into a singular new universe, and you're going to get the X-Men, the Fantastic Four, probably some Spider-Man villains, the ones they care enough to keep, and it's going to bring Venom into the MCU. That's my thought. That's my theory. Let me know what you guys think down in the comment section, and I will catch you all later. Peace.